Before you come for your very first appointment in my clinic, I'd like to introduce myself a little bit and tell you about the amazing science that sits behind the havening techniques that I use. So by background, I'm a medical specialist. I've worked in public hospitals for about 35 years. I'm an anesthetic specialist. I've been involved in really high-tech medicine, working in operating rooms, in intensive care and in resuscitation. And I've also been a significant healthcare leader as an advisor to the New Zealand government and the World Health Organization. My wife and I have campaigned all around the world to try to bring more compassion and humanity to healthcare, and that work has taken us to about 15 countries. So this work I do to relieve people of their trauma, this healing work, is really an extension of those many years of work on human connection and compassion and healing. So I'd like to explain to you a little bit about the science that sits behind this amazing technique, havening techniques. The developer of this is a medical doctor and researcher in the USA called Dr. Ronald Ruden, and he has a busy medical practice in New York and works with a number of doctors, and he's a PhD research scientist, and he's spent nearly 20 years exploring what happens in our brains when we get traumatized and what are the mechanisms by which we can rapidly heal from that. And he has published many papers on trauma and addiction, and is the author of several books on the subject as well. And he's the person who has just painstakingly figured out exactly what happens in our brains when we undergo traumatic events and how we can heal ourselves from these events very quickly. Because his astonishing discovery is that in every single one of us, we have this capacity. Our brain has a mechanism to rapidly delete trauma, to remove the traces from the neural circuits in the part of the brain where that's held, and to just relieve you from that permanently. And the work I now do is the most astonishing and gratifying I've ever done in my entire career as a doctor. So I started training in havening techniques 3 years ago, and I have a busy practice here in Raglan, and I'm also certified as one of the international trainers. So I'm training up lots of health professionals, including a growing number of doctors, to be aware of and to be able to use these amazing techniques. And the results I see are really profoundly life-changing. So what Dr. Ruden has discovered is really what happens inside our brains, in a particular part of the brain, when we undergo a traumatic event. And the part of the brain we're interested in is called the amygdala. It's our safety system. It's kind of like our Department of Homeland Security. So it's scanning all of the sensory information that's coming to us, the millions of bits of information through our sight, our hearing, our touch, all our senses. And it's scanning that information for any whisper of something that could be dangerous or could be a threat to us. And it's remembering threats from the past, and it's ready to react within less than 1/10 of a second, can receive that incoming data through our senses and be ready to mount a fight or flight reaction to defend ourselves against a potential hazard. So Dr. Ruden has listed the very detailed neural pathways and the molecular mechanisms by which this happens. So when we undergo a terrifying traumatic event, like a terrible car crash, for instance, then it's like we kind of create a multimedia web image of that whole traumatic event. So everything that happened to us, the setting, the context, all those subtle bits of information that can become triggers for the traumatic memory to be reactivated in the future. All of that information gets stored in enormous detail. All the events that happened to us that were frightening or threatening or painful or that hurt us, all of that sensory information, our body posture, our pain, our position, our muscle tension, our internal reactions, our emotions, our stress responses, our muscle tension, our racing heart, the tightness in the chest, all of these sensations are stored in this hardwired memory in a part of the brain called the amygdala. And the way that the brain stores this memory is that, which is different, it's very distinct from an ordinary memory, which is stored in another part of the brain called the hippocampus. So this traumatic memory that we're talking about, it's created within minutes by new nerve connections forming in the amygdala. And the way that new nerve connections are formed is that the nerve has a molecular kind of on-off switch called a receptor, and there's hundreds or thousands of the receptors all on the surface of the cell ready to be stimulated. And when one nerve fires a signal that gets to the end of a terminal, there's a little burst of chemical, and one molecule of that chemical can lock onto a receptor and activate it and cause a small signal. And if enough receptors are activated all at once, then it creates a signal in the next nerve. We've got a new join between nerves. So during a traumatic event, the nerve cells have got this big warehouse full of spare receptors, and they push them up to the surface of the cell, and they're locked in place. They're super glued into the cell membrane with a molecular bond called phosphate. And they're there for the rest of our lives. So at any time in the future, if our senses detect any information coming into our senses that in any way reminds us, even subconsciously, or resembles that frightening event, then the whole traumatic memory can be triggered. When the traumatic memory is triggered, the whole kind of web image of that trauma comes into being again in the present moment. Our brain doesn't know that trauma is in the past. So we get the intense emotional reactions, the fear, the anxiety. We get the body responses, the tension of the muscles, the body posture, the readiness to flee or to fight. We get all our internal stress responses, like pushing up the blood pressure and the cortisol and the stress hormones. And all these things are triggered instantly in less than a second when our senses detect that this horrible thing might be happening again. So for instance, if you've had a traumatic event that's being in a car crash, then maybe the side of a car, getting into a car, the smell of a car, the particular body posture you have, that the side of vehicles coming fast towards you, any of these little things can be triggers. So that if you have a traumatic memory that's caused a phobia of being in a car, a phobia of having a car crash, then all the time you're having these fear responses and these body responses and these stress responses. So that information is hardwired in the part of the brain called the amygdala. And it's not something that we can think our way out of, because this is hardwired into the operating system of our brain, right? So if you have a Windows 10 computer, it has an operating system called Windows 10, and that's the software built into the computer that tells the computer exactly how to work. We download software programs to do useful things on the computer, but it doesn't matter how many software programs we download into the computer, it doesn't change the operating system. So our thoughts, our conscious thoughts, our cognition, that's a bit like software. So you can go to talk therapy, but talk therapy is very inefficient at getting down into the operating system level of the brain. So no matter how much you try and talk your way out of your emotional reactions or your stress reactions or your body reactions, it's extremely difficult because this is hardwired in the part of the brain that's part of your operating system, and it's there for the rest of your life. So my world record for that is with my mum. I havened her on her 90th birthday for a traumatic event that had occurred on her first day at school when she was age 5. And she'd had that trauma hardwired, encoded in her brain for 85 years. And in 10 minutes, we'd completely erased it. And in the process of erasing that trauma, we actually removed the nerve connections. Those receptors that are making the new nerve connections, we precisely activate the part of the brain where that's being held. We uncover the lock on those receptors. There's a series of chemical reactions that occur that dissolve away that super bond so that the receptor becomes free in the cell membrane. And then there's another molecular mechanism that grabs these receptors and they pull them into the cell and they dispose of them. So they're gone. And this molecular reaction occurs in 5 to 7 minutes. And it's miraculous to see that in action. So how do we make that work? Well, this is the genius of Dr. Ruden, the developer of Havening, because he's really figured out the whole story. So what he's taught us is that during a traumatic event, we have a big stress response, and we have very high frequency brain waves in our brain. They're called gamma waves. They're 30 or 50 or 100 cycles a second, and if we could listen inside, the brain would hear zzz, a hum of that high frequency. And the mechanism inside the cell, the molecular mechanism, it turns out that is frequency sensitive. During a traumatic event, it sees that high frequency brain wave and it says, okay, I'm going to push lots of receptors up to the cell surface, I'll lock them in place, I'm going to store all that information so that for the rest of our life, I'm going to be warned if this scary or threatening thing would ever happen again. So that's trauma, high frequency. What he found out through the different strands of research that he pulled together in all the different scientific papers is that the key to healing is very low frequency brainwaves called delta waves. These are very slow delta waves, less than 1 per second typically. And the only time as adults that we normally have high levels of delta waves is during deep sleep, also called slow wave sleep. And that's a time of healing and replenishment, and also to do with consolidating memories into the cortex. So having found out that delta waves are really important, he further elucidated that this mechanism inside the nerve cell, this frequency sensitive mechanism, can sense those low frequency brain waves, and then it reverses the encoding of the trauma. So it activates the enzymes that dissolve away that phosphate bond. The receptors become free in the cell membrane. It grabs the receptors, pulls them into the cell, and gets rid of them during low frequency. So how do we get the brain into that healing state with those delta waves? And this is another intuitive leap that Dr. Ruden made. He had an intuitive feeling and understanding that certain forms of soothing human touch are really important for healing. And together with a neuroscientist called Mel Harper, they researched this in the neuroscience lab. So they got lots of different subjects into the neuroscience lab. They wired up their brains with electrodes to measure the brain waves. And they tried various forms of stimulation to the skin, tapping, vibration, touch, to different parts of the skin. And what they showed is that there are 3 areas of the skin that are particularly sensitive. And when these are stroked in a certain way, it generates very high levels of delta waves, these low frequency brain waves in the brain very quickly. And these are actually all very intuitive forms of touch. So the first is rubbing on the palms of the hands. And you see people doing this when they're nervous, or else they rub their hands up and down on their thighs. That's not stimulating the thighs, that's stimulating the palms of the hands. And that helps to reduce your nervousness because it's increasing the delta waves in the brain. The second form of touch is a downward stroke on the upper arm. This is the empathetic touch, right? If one of our friends or family members is distressed, we reach out to touch them in this part of the body, and often with a little downward stroke. So these are very intuitive forms of touch. And the third area is really anywhere on the face. So we can go across the forehead and down the side, we can go across the cheeks. We can do like a full face wash. Doesn't really matter what you do. And that's the third area. And mothers do this to babies. Again, when the baby is distressed, the mother will stroke the baby's face, and very quickly the baby will start to relax. So these delta waves have multiple effects in the brain. They raise the levels of all the feel-good chemicals like serotonin and oxytocin. They raise an inhibitory neurotransmitter that dampens down all the stress responses. And it triggers that mechanism inside the nerve cells that can dissolve away those receptors on the surface of the cell and break the nerve connections. And what that means is that we no longer have a connection between the sensory trigger and the output of the traumatic memory. So the person that did have this phobia of being in a car, of driving a car after that terrible car crash, when we've erased that memory, they'll get in the car and there'll be completely no response. They can smell the smell of the car. They can see the vehicles coming towards them. They can have all those familiar things that remind them of being in a car or on a road journey, and it has no response at all because we have broken apart the connection that connects that sensory input to the traumatic output of the traumatic memory. And this is the absolute miracle of this therapy. So as a therapist, I'm not doing any healing to you. You have this amazing, powerful healing mechanism inside your own brain, and I'm just creating the conditions under which this wonderful healing mechanism can work most effectively. So in myself, I can show how quickly these forms of touch change my brainwaves, because I'm a bit of a geek, and of course I have my own brainwave monitor, and I have a band that goes across my forehead, and it has electrodes, and it measures my brainwaves, and it's hooked up to an app on my iPhone. And I want to show you just a couple of screenshots from that. So I'm going to just try and show this to you clearly. It's kind of hard to do. So on this side here, we've got all the different brain frequencies across here. So these are the low frequency, the delta waves, and these are all the way up to the high frequency, the gamma waves. And these little colored bars are going up and down in real time depending on how much energy there is in each frequency of the brainwave. And this is 26 seconds into recording, and I'm meditating, so my brain is very quiet and there's very little activity here. And then 30 seconds later, immediately I've done the first screenshot, I've started doing this havening touch to myself, and you can see that there's just this massive increase in the delta waves here. So the low frequency brain waves are massively increased, and that's, to me as a doctor, when I first saw that, I was so astonished that I just about fell off my chair. I mean, there was just nothing in medical science that could prepare me to know that some really simple forms of touch can radically change the state of my brain and can trigger this amazing healing reaction. And I've seen that happen I've done this hundreds and hundreds of times with different clients. I've seen the most awful traumatic events and phobias disappear very quickly. Now, with a major trauma, we usually can't delete the whole traumatic memory all at once. So it might take 2 or 3 goes, which you can do in one session. So the way we precisely focus the healing mechanism is to ask the client to very briefly recall the memory. And you don't have to tell me anything about it. I certainly don't want you to be traumatized again, having to tell me the story of this, really horrible thing that happened to you. And the only thing you have to do is maybe for 30 seconds or 1 minute, just bring it to your memory. And what that does is it activates very precisely only the nerves in the amygdala that hold that precise trauma. And it activates the nerves, it changes the voltage on them, the cover on that superglue bond on the receptor, that goes away so that we can work on that. So the moment that we've activated that memory, what we do is we get a calibration of how distressing that was, and then we begin the havening touch. Now, I can do this therapy by Zoom video connection, and you can sit at home and you will do the touch like this yourself, and I'll do it with you, and we can be connected on a video just like this. Or in my clinic, you can do the same. You can sit on the couch on the other side of the room, and I can guide you through the whole process. But the majority of my clients choose to come and do therapy in chairs, and I sit close, and I just check out your permission that you're completely comfortable for me to touch your hands and your upper arms and the face, just reminding you the specificity of those forms of touch. The reason we're doing it is to create the delta waves. And if you're completely comfortable and at ease with that, then it may work a little faster if I apply the touch to you as a client. So we activate the memory, we get a score for the distress, we start the havening touch, and then I don't want you thinking about that horrible event anymore, because that might reinforce it. So we use mental distractions. So we use all sorts of crazy things to occupy your mind. I might invite you to do alphabet shopping in the supermarket. So you have to find an item starting with A and then B and then C, and name each item as you put it in the trolley. To climb steps and count them out loud. To tell me about your best holiday. Anything at all I can do to occupy your mind and not have you thinking about that horrible trauma. So we do this together, the havening touch and the mental distractions, just for about 5 or 6 minutes, because that's the amount of time that the molecular reaction in the amygdala, that part of the brain where the trauma is held, that molecular reaction, once it's activated, it only runs for about 5 or 6 minutes. So we do the havening touch for that long, we do the distractions, and then invite you to go back to that memory again, that traumatic memory, not to tell me about it, just to recall it in your mind. And what that does, it reactivates the memory, but now it seems a bit softer. It's not so distressing. Now you give me a new score. And then we start the havening touch again, and we do a new round of distractions with havening touch. And we do that for 5 or 6 minutes. And we keep going, and we just see the score come down and down and down until the score is 0. And at that point, no matter how hard you try to access that traumatic memory, you just can't connect to the feelings anymore. And all the distress is gone. And what you also find is that not only the emotional reactions, but the body reactions and the stress reactions have dissolved away. And we believe this change is permanent. Furthermore, sometimes the visual memory changes in subtle and sometimes amusing ways to kind of change the nature of the story so it's no longer threatening to you. my computer screen just timed out, so I had to restart it. So that's one of the techniques we use in havening, and that's when you have a clearly recalled traumatic event. Now, many of you will have early life trauma, and before about the age of 4 or 5, you probably don't have a conscious memory of the events that nonetheless traumatized you and got hardwired in your brain and affect your feelings, your body reactions, your stress responses, your motivations, and that can cause a lot of difficulty in life. So we've got a whole variety of havening techniques or processes. If we don't have a story, a memory we can work with, then we work with the symptoms you have, because you have painful emotions, you have stress responses, you have body symptoms. You might have a headache or neck ache or chronic backache or a pain or tightness in your throat or your chest, or there's lots of different physical symptoms that can get hardwired and coded as part of the trauma. So whatever is the thing causing you the problems in life, that's what we work with directly. And bit by bit by bit, we erase that trauma. We relieve you of those automatic emotional and stress reactions so that you can live your life at the best potential. You're free to be the best version of yourself. The other thing about delta waves is that when we're small children, when we're babies and small children, that's the time when we form our most powerful core beliefs. Am I okay? Am I lovable? Am I safe? Am I secure? Is the world okay? Do I have secure attachments? All these, the deepest core beliefs we have about ourselves are formed in early life, before about the age of 3. What we know from the neuroscience of the developing brain is that the predominant brainwave in that immature young brain are actually the delta waves, okay? The ones we've heard about before, the very slow frequency waves. So what's wonderful is that a lot of people with major trauma have very low sense of self-worth, and what we can do in havening, when we get you into that delta wave state, we can start to shift those personal beliefs about myself. We can restore in you a profound sense of being okay, of being good enough, of being worthy, of being innocent. And we can do that very powerful with havening. So there's a whole variety of approaches we can use for different kinds of conditions. So I really look forward to meeting you, and I can explain a lot more about it, and no doubt you'll have some questions and you can ask me at the time. But I just found myself explaining this again and again and again and again to every new client, so I thought I'd put it on video. It'll save us a bit of time on the day. We can get cracking doing the real work, and it'll be just a tremendous pleasure to see you. So nice to talk to you for now. Bye.